Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Edge of Worlds by Martha Wells. So this is the fourth-ish book in the Books of the Roxura series. My confusion there has to do with the short story collections, but I'll get to that. The important thing is that this is pretty far along in a series, so yeah, there will be spoilers for the first 3 books. Maybe wait to watch this review until after you've read them, or at very least watch my previous review videos of all of them, which I've helpfully put into one little playlist for you, because I love me some playlists. But what is this book synopsis in this video is going to be a bit haphazard for reasons that hopefully will become clear as I talk through my opinions on the book. The story starts with a shared dream that may or may not be a vision for the future. A vision where the Fel are invading the Indigo Cloud Court, killing everyone. Because of this dream, Moon and his people are on the lookout for anything that could be a sign that disaster is coming. So when an old friend, Dellen, a scholar from the Golden Islands, shows up with an expedition of strangers, they know something important is happening. These strangers are scholars who have discovered an ancient city that may or may not be a ruined city of the Forerunners, the peoples that both the Roxura and the Fel descended from. Dellen is afraid that another ancient evil might be waiting in this city, like there was waiting in the previous Forerunner city they found. There may be a good chance that only Fel or Roxura, or maybe even only a crossbreed of the two, can enter the city. There's a good chance it's not a Forerunner city, but instead a city of another ancient lost people called the Foundation Builders. There's a good chance there's nothing inside. There's a good chance that anything left inside will just kill anyone who makes it inside. But there's a chance that the Roxura do not go with these people and investigate. The Fel might get an ancient weapon that will give them the power to conquer and eat all the peoples of the world. Jade, Moon, Chime, Stone, and all the other Indigo Cloud Roxura feel like they cannot ignore this. And so a small group set out with these mysterious, possibly untrustworthy strangers to investigate, just hoping to figure out the mystery before the Fel, all the while knowing that any action they take might be the one that dooms the world. So first I want to say, I'm a bit annoyed at myself because I skipped the short story collections when I picked this one up. There are 2 Stories of the Roxura collections, and I mean, I own one of them already and the other one is on the way. And I knew that one of these collections included at least one story that took place between book 3 and book 4. But I mean, that's not rare for fantasy series, to have these collections of stories that fill in stuff that happened otherwise off-page in the main series. And they're always just sort of extra stuff. They're usually fun bits of backstory or adventure. Like, I know that one of the collections includes the story of when Chime first woke up to find himself a winged Roxura instead of an Arbura. And, like, that's cool, that's interesting. You don't necessarily need to know the story of that day to understand the full series. They are basically bonus material for when you've read the main story and just can't get enough. But I think that this time, that might not quite have been the case. There is a lot in the what happened last time exposition in this book that clearly references one or more of those stories. So I get the feeling they might have actually been a bit more serious to the continuing narrative. Including, I know for a fact, like, it's very obvious that, Book 3, one of the main arcs of tension building is Moon and Jade wanting to have kids and waiting to have kids and trying to figure out what's going to happen with babies, and the actual having of babies takes place in one of those stories. And this one starts up 2 years after the fact, and it sort of feels like I missed a climax there. I also want to say that this is a very middle of a series kind of book. I would not ever suggest reading this one as the first one that you read in this series. Most of our main characters, the big character buildings bits, all come in the first 3 books. A lot of the core world building is already done. Yeah, we are exploring new places and cultures, but the foundations, pun intended, were laid out in the previous books. Even the overarching series-wide conflict has already been slightly established. Like, yeah, you're getting more pieces of it as we go along, but if you jump in here, there's going to be a lot that you just don't quite get. Also, this is clearly not the last of the series. There is very much still stuff happening, and hell, this one doesn't even have, like, a really solid ending. Like, this one cannot be read as a standalone. This one feels like the last two books in this series were originally one really long book, and the author realized it'd gotten too long and just found a good stopping place to cut it in half. So yeah, this is in no way a standalone book. And a lot of its foibles stem from that fact. The most noticeable one, to me at least, is the fact that this book has a weird rhythm. There are miles and miles of rising action and setup, a really short climax, and we sort of just end with barely any falling action to speak of whatsoever. If you were to map this book out on a chart, about 90% of it would be a gradually building hill with an itty bitty climax and like a plateau at the end. So like the chart would look something like this, which is not the chart of a normal book. There's very little action throughout the entire thing. We are just basically getting to know people, learn history, getting explanations of how the different technologies and magics work, building relationships with new characters, seeing where established characters are at emotionally, getting place descriptions and discussing possibilities of what's happening. There's a lot of travel, but it's a bit like the Two Towers, where half the book is just characters running, but this one lacks the urgency of the chase. So it sort of just feels like nothing is happening for the longest time. And like, in retrospect, I don't think any of this needed to be cut or anything. Like, I think all the setup goes somewhere, or will in the next book, but it's just a lot to read through. And because of that, I did not find myself being violently drawn into this book like a whirlpool, the way all other Martha Wells books have done to me. And the ending felt abrupt. It is so clearly just a tiniest breathing resting point before we dive into the action of the next book. I will say the ending did end up feeling fulfilling. Like, it doesn't feel like it's a fake ending. There's enough of a big reveal, enough of a fight, enough action, and enough emotion that it feels solid. It's just really sudden. And this one does what I've been expecting to happen ever since book 2. We are finally starting down the path of finding out what is wrong with this world. What was the great cataclysm that left all these ruins, all these lost cultures? And I hopefully think fixing it? Maybe? I mentioned back in my review of The Serpent Sea that it felt like this series was going to follow the arc of first Moon finding a community that he is willing to fight for, then driving the Roxura to fight for the greater community of all the sentient beings in this world. But while I was aware that that was the broadest shape of the series, this is the first time in this series I feel like I have an idea of what the resolution is going to look like. With most books, I feel like vaguely I can feel out what a resolution should look like as early as about halfway through. And that's not a bad thing. I'm not saying that books are inherently predictable or boring or obvious. What I'm saying is that if it's done correctly, the groundwork is there for the ending. Once the author has enough setup laid out and enough pieces are on the board, you can see what the puzzle is going to look like, what the picture is going to look like when it's complete. And that's good. It's what makes a story feel right. If a book doesn't have enough of these foundations down that you can vaguely guess what a resolution should look like, it generally feels like when the resolution comes, it's out of nowhere, or doesn't even really make sense. Often this is what leads to books having endings that feel unearned. And that just does not a satisfying story make. And this has been a series that has been very slow about laying down the puzzle pieces that the reader needs to guess the full picture. It hasn't been so slow as to feel directionless, but it's been close at times. Wells has been laying down the pieces, but there have been so few and far between that this was the first book that I finished it and felt like I could see what the puzzle is going to look like. and I can see, okay, the main picture here is going to feature the crossbreeds and how they relate to the Forerunners. And I like where it's going. It looks interesting, it looks fulfilling, it looks the right level of world altering without feeling ridiculously huge. On a brief side note, I said in the last review, the one for the Siren Depths, that if the ending was just a stopping point in the greater journey, I was happy with it. But if it was meant to be more of a standalone book, it would feel rather anticlimactic. And the good news is I can now firmly say it was not anticlimactic. We are still building from that ending. It still works as a part of the series. But back to main point. Furthering my feeling that the series has the Roxura as a people following the arc that Moon took in the first book, in this book, for the first time, we're seeing other characters' POVs. It's still mostly in Moon's POV, but we get a couple of sections from Live's point of view, one from Ember's, a couple from Merit's, and one from River's. And while, yes, some of this is purely functional, we needed to see what was happening when Moon was not physically present or was unconscious. But it feels like this is a sign of the broadening of the story. There is this feeling that this is no longer just the story of one lost Roxura looking for his place in the world. It's about the Roxura in general finding their place in the world. It's also just fun. I love the contrast in the different characters' voices. It's very different seeing the Roxura culture from the POV of a character like Ember, who grew up in it and understands its intricacies instinctively, the way Southerners understand what bless his heart means. Versus the way Moon sees it, more as an outsider and feeling it out constantly and trying to learn, like, what's happening. It's also just a lovely shortcut to get us attached to a character. So even someone like River, who has been a pretty unlikable character throughout most of the series and is just now getting a redemption arc, we get a sort of jump start by getting a section from his point of view. We're built in immediately to see empathy with him. And I like it, it's good. Now, partially because this book moves so slowly, it does highlight some of the things I don't actually like about Wells's writing. She is honestly prone to over-explaining, spending pages and pages telling us how the various airships work, which, yes, it will come into play in the story, but I just didn't need a full layout and tour of every single ship to get that. We are told all the time where everyone is, at every moment. Even when, frankly, it does not matter which warrior is on guard on which side of the ship. And while I love all the varieties of different peoples and the cultures in the world, I don't need a breakdown of the color, head covering, skin texture, body structure, and features of every single one. Weirdly, the exact opposite is also true of Wells's writing. Sometimes shit just never gets explained, and I usually really like this, because, like, in the real world, we don't have answers to every why. So it works for me that we never exactly find out why the people built the city on the back of the Leviathan in the Serpent Sea, or where the rest of the Porter Builders went in the Fall of the Orain series. But yeah, there are a lot of things that are in this book that just are, with no explanation. And Wells also honestly sometimes just has too many tetrary characters. There are about 7 million characters that we know their name, what species they are, and maybe one other fact about them. And I always struggle to keep them straight. Especially in this series, because all the Roxura have names like Stone, Moon, Song, Chime. They're all objects. And I don't know why, but that made it really hard for me to keep them straight in my head in the beginning. And all of that exists in every Wells book I've ever read. But when the story is moving quickly, it's less noticeable. It feels like what it's supposed to feel like. It feels like it's painting a lovely and detailed backdrop for the story. By about halfway through most of her books, it's become obvious who is the more important characters, who I can sort of forget, and some of them have usually been killed off, so it's just easier. It just becomes more clear what information / lack of information drives the story, and what is just background. But because most of this book is just set up for the next, I'm only beginning to get a feeling that I know what's important in the last, 50 pages of the book, which was far too late. Also, huge parts of the miles of rising action was about Moon's emotional journey of deciding if fatherhood changes whether or not he's the person who goes out and fights the court's battles. And there was something that felt directionless and like a waste of time about it. I think part of this might be just that fatherhood and motherhood conflicts are just not something that draw me in. They're not conflicts that really interest me. But I think there's more than that going on here. No other character really even questions whether or not Moon is going. They all just assume. And we as readers know that he is going because he's the protagonist, and that is clearly the action of the book. There's no tension there. And more than that, it feels like Moon himself is only going through the motions of having an emotional struggle. Like, he knows he should be struggling with the stay at home and protect his babies or go out and fight the evil with Jade and Chime, and so he tells everyone that he's not sure when he really is from the very beginning. And that could have been covered in a paragraph or two, but it's chapters of him trying to decide. During all this section, Moon honestly felt a lot more like the Moon of Book 1, before you realize why his emotional reactions feel a bit shallow and disconnected, before we realize how much of what we see of him in that beginning is all just a mask. And there is an interesting journey in that, of Moon trying and failing to wear the mask of a proper consort, but it's a journey we've done before in this series, and done it better. That's his entire journey in book 2, and so it feels like we're covering the same ground, and just not as deeply. So a lot of that section felt like treading water to me. There's also the arcs with Callum and Stone. Both of them have something going on that Moon doesn't know what it is. Stone just keeps wandering away. Moon keeps thinking he's acting distant, and maybe even a little bit distracted. And Callum, who is the young son of one of the random scholars that discovered the city, seems weirdly fascinated and interested in Moon. One of these arcs gets some resolution in this book, though it feels like the story is nowhere near complete, like there's just been enough to tell us vaguely what's going on. But the other one? No resolution whatsoever. No idea what's happening with it. And I think in a way that's fine, because this book flows so completely into the next. And I'm assuming both of those get finished arcs in the next book, but I don't know, because I haven't read it. And I can't start reading it yet, because they haven't arrived. I'm currently so pissed because the order of books that was supposed to arrive today didn't. And I really want to just pick up Harbors of the Sun, or whatever it's called, immediately, and I can't because it's not physically here. But being unable to dive directly into the next book, those two arcs feel really lacking at the moment. Like, I feel like there's something, like, obviously incomplete, but also just not really even started yet. Hilariously, when I finished this book last night, I went to sleep worried I would struggle to find anything to say about it in a review, because so much of it is just character building and set building, and I was like, am I gonna have anything to say? And then I sat down to write, and nope, I've got plenty to say. And I always do this with Martha Wells books. And I think it's because she manages to just pack an inhumanly large amount into these books. Especially this one, because so much of it is setup, and setup is really what she clearly loves and is good at. I really enjoyed this book once it started moving, though honestly I was a bit frustrated by the incredibly long rising action. And it's because there's just too much in this book. It's so much that about halfway through, I almost went back to start reading it again from the beginning, because I knew I was missing a lot. And even having finished it, I still feel like I missed some really important stuff. And part of it was because I couldn't stay focused because there was just so much information coming in. It's an odd book, and one I would definitely not suggest ever trying to read as a standalone. I really doubt this one will be anyone's favorite in the series, but it's a solid part of the series. I just really want to read the next one already, damn it.